Okay, we're going to go ahead and run through how to do crosstabs with a chi-square test using the American National Election Studies 2024 pilot. So, as always, it's going to be important to make sure that the variables that you're using are coded correctly, you're aware of how they're coded, and all missing values are accounted for. So that is the case with these variables that I want to use. So I'm going to go to Analyze Descriptive Statistics and then crosstabs. That is the thing about the chi-square, is it actually lives in the descriptive statistics section as it is an add-on to descriptive crosstabs, which is a little bit different from the rest of the bivariate tests, but that is how SPSS sorts things out. So I've got a couple of different variables here. You want to choose a variable to go in your row and a variable to go in your column. I have here a variable called poll disk socialmed1, which I was using earlier, that merely asks people if they'd used Facebook over the course of the past year, with 1 and 2 being our valid codes. 1 for they had, 2 for they had not. And I have another one called emplos AI. This is, once again, a code I had to make sure the missing values were accounted for, which they previously were not by default. And then all the valid codes are responses that are how much a individual is worried about losing their job to AI in the future. With the lower codes corresponding with little worry, 1 being not at all, and the higher codes corresponding with greater worry, 5 being extremely. So we're going to see if there's a relationship between if somebody's used Facebook in the past year and if they are worried about losing their job to AI. So to get the chi-square test, which is not on by default, you have to go to statistics and make sure that chi-square is checked. So we're going to look at how the categories interact with one another, but unless we have the chi-square test, we're not actually going to have a statistical test that gives us a p-value to establish if there's a statistically significant pattern here in the interaction between how people fall into the various categories. The other thing we're going to want to click is cells. In cells, you choose where you get your percentages from for rows, columns, total. Generally, you're going to want to just choose one of these to keep things from getting too crowded in your crosstabs. You can kind of play with either choosing row or column depending on your specific purposes. I'm going to start off with column here and see how much sense it makes for my purposes. That's going to put my percentages on I'm going to start with rows. That's going to put my percentages on the rows, which is where I have my social media or my Facebook variable. So I'm going to click OK. And this is what I get. The very first thing you will probably want to look at is the Pearson chi-square's p-value. In this case, it's not less than 0.05, so it's not statistically significant. It doesn't appear that there's much of a relationship here between if somebody's used Facebook in the last year and if they're concerned about losing their job to AI. I have on my crosstabs here the percentages on the rows. So among those who had used Facebook in the past year, about 59% of them weren't concerned at all about AI taking their job, about 19% a little, about 12.5% moderately, about 5% very, and about 5% extremely. And that all adds up to 100%. The picture is not all that different down here, hence why it's not statistically significant. A little bit more were not concerned at all if they hadn't used Facebook. But these numbers, by and large, are relatively similar to the numbers in the group that had used Facebook. Just to give you an idea of what this would look like if we put our percentages on the columns, we'll get the same chi-square, but things just look a little bit differently, and it's a little bit different when you interpret the output of the chi-square. So in this case, we have our percentages on the columns. So to interpret it this way, among those who are not concerned at all about losing their job to AI, about 81.5% had used Facebook in the last year, about 18.5% had not. Those concerned a little, about 83.5% had used Facebook in the last year, about 16.5% had not. Those who are moderately concerned, 81% had used Facebook in the last year, 19 had not. those who were very concerned, 88.4% had used Facebook in the last year. 11.6 had not, and among those who were extremely concerned about losing their jobs to AI, 94.7% had used Facebook in the last year, and just over 5% had not. You'll notice that in spite of the fact that we have our columns carrying the percentages here, and the interpretation is a little bit different, the fundamental chi-square test hasn't changed at all. These results still are not statistically significant, which is not surprising given that the differences between the categories are not all that different. And also at the same time, the N is not massive. We have just a little bit under 1,000 cases here. So in this case, we can pretty definitively say that there is no relationship that is observed between using Facebook in the past year and being concerned that your job might be lost to AI.